The afternoon of March 17th, 1938, was cold and overcast in Harlem, with temperatures in the low 40s and a steady wind coming off the Hudson River. By 2:30 in the afternoon, most businesses along Lenox Avenue were operating normally, shops serving customers, restaurants preparing for the dinner rush, numbers runners making their collections from the morning's play. Bumpy Johnson was 32 years old in March 1938 and had been operating in Harlem's criminal economy for 19 years since arriving from Charleston, South Carolina in 1919. Johnson had worked for Stephanie St. Clair during the early 1930s, had fought a brutal war against Dutch Schultz from 1933 to 1935 that involved more than 40 kidnappings and murders, and had negotiated an agreement with Lucky Luciano in 1935 that allowed Harlem bookmakers to maintain independence while paying tribute to Luciano's organization. This agreement had been operating successfully for 3 years. Johnson maintained an office above a restaurant on Lenox Avenue, where he conducted business, met with associates, and received information from the network of people throughout Harlem who kept him informed about activities in the neighborhood. Johnson was reviewing financial records from the previous week's numbers operations when Henry Lawson entered the office at approximately 2:45. Lawson was 28 years old and had worked for Johnson for 6 years as a driver, bodyguard, and trusted associate. Lawson's face showed unusual tension as he approached Johnson's desk. Lawson stated that he had information about a serious problem that required immediate attention, but that the information was sensitive and concerned people outside Harlem. Johnson put aside the financial records and gave Lawson his complete attention. Lawson explained that a source who worked at a warehouse in the Bronx had overheard a conversation between two men about a kidnapping. The men had been discussing keeping someone locked in a basement and had mentioned that the person was Italian and that his family would pay significant money for his return. The source had not been able to hear all the details, but had caught enough fragments to understand that a kidnapping was in progress and that the kidnappers were planning to demand ransom. Johnson asked several specific questions. Where was the warehouse? Well, when had the conversation occurred? Who were the men? What exactly had they said? Did the source know where the captive was being held? Why had the source brought this information to Lawson? Lawson provided what information he had. The warehouse was located on 3rd Avenue in the Bronx near 149th Street. The conversation had occurred that morning around 11 o'clock. The two men were not known to Lawson's source by name, but were white, appeared to be in their 30s, and spoke with Irish accents. The source had heard one man say something about the Italian kid and his uncle has money, and $5 grand easy. The source did not know where the captive was being held. The source had brought the information to Lawson because the source knew that Lawson worked for Johnson, and because the source had heard rumors that Johnson had connections to Italian organized crime and might be interested in information about a kidnapping involving Italians. Johnson sat quietly for approximately 1 minute, processing this information. A kidnapping of someone connected to Italian organized crime was potentially significant for several reasons. If the victim was related to someone important in the Italian mob, the kidnapping represented a major violation that would require response. If Johnson had information about the kidnapping and did not share it, he could be seen as complicit or indifferent to crimes against mob families. If Johnson did share the information and it proved valuable, and he could strengthen his relationship with Italian crime families, but acting on incomplete information was dangerous. Johnson needed to know more before taking any action. Johnson instructed Lawson to return to the source and get more specific information. What exactly had the men said? Was there any mention of names, either the victim's name or the kidnappers' names? Was there any indication of where the victim was being held? Were the men connected to any known criminal organization? Lawson left immediately to gather additional information. Johnson spent the next 2 hours making discreet inquiries through his network about whether anyone had heard about kidnappings, about whether any Italian mob figures had family members who were missing, and about whether any Irish criminals in the Bronx were known for kidnapping operations. This investigation required careful communication because Johnson could not reveal what he knew without understanding the full situation. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Lawson returned with additional information from the source. The source had managed to overhear more conversation between the same two men. One of them had mentioned Luciano specifically and had said, "his nephew," and "the old man will pay anything to get him back." The men had also mentioned a location in the Bronx, a building on Prospect Avenue near 163rd Street, and had discussed moving the captive to a different location in 2 days because they believed their current location might be discovered. Johnson now had enough information to understand the seriousness of the situation. If the victim was Lucky Luciano's nephew, this was not just any kidnapping, but a direct attack on one of the most powerful crime figures in New York. Luciano had been Johnson's ally since 1935, and the agreement between them had been mutually beneficial and stable. Johnson also understood that Luciano operated according to strict codes about family and loyalty, and that rescuing his nephew would create an obligation that could significantly strengthen the Johnson-Luciano relationship. Johnson also recognized that acting quickly was essential because the kidnappers planned to move the victim in 2 days, which would make rescue much more difficult. But Johnson needed to verify the information before acting. Making accusations or taking action based on incomplete or incorrect information could damage Johnson's credibility and relationships. Johnson spent March 17th evening and March 18th morning conducting careful investigation to verify what Lawson's source had reported. Johnson sent trusted associates to the Bronx to observe the building on Prospect Avenue near 163rd Street. Johnson also made discreet inquiries with contacts who knew about Luciano's family to determine whether Luciano had a nephew and whether anyone in Luciano's circle had reported a family member missing. By the afternoon of March 18th, Johnson had confirmation on multiple points. The building on Prospect Avenue was a 3-story residential structure that appeared mostly vacant. Johnson's associates had observed 2 white men entering and leaving the building at irregular intervals. Contacts who knew about Luciano's family confirmed that Luciano had a nephew named Anthony Lucania, who was 19 years old and who had not been seen for 3 days, though no official missing person report had been filed, and Luciano's organization had not publicly acknowledged the disappearance. Johnson now understood that the kidnapping was real, that the victim was almost certainly Luciano's nephew, that the kidnappers were holding him at a specific location in the Bronx, and the time was limited because the kidnappers planned to move their captive within approximately 36 hours. Johnson made a decision. Johnson would organize a rescue operation to recover Luciano's nephew before the kidnappers moved him or made ransom demands that would complicate the situation. This decision reflected several strategic calculations. Rescuing Luciano's nephew would demonstrate Johnson's intelligence capabilities, his willingness to help allies even without being asked, and his ability to operate effectively outside Harlem. The rescue would create a significant obligation from Luciano that would strengthen their relationship and increase Johnson's leverage in future negotiations. The operation would also send a message to other criminals that kidnapping people connected to Johnson's allies would be discovered and would trigger responses. However, the operation needed to be executed carefully. A failed rescue attempt could result in the nephew being killed. A rescue that involved violence against the wrong people could create problems with Irish criminal organizations. A rescue that damaged property or attracted excessive police attention could create complications. What was needed was a plan that would secure the nephew's safe release while minimizing risks and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Between March 18th afternoon and March 19th morning, Johnson organized a coalition of people who would help execute the rescue operation. This coalition required people with different skills and capabilities. The first critical ally was Samuel Foster, who was 35 years old and who had worked for Johnson for 8 years. Foster had grown up in the Bronx and knew the neighborhood around Prospect Avenue thoroughly. Foster also had contacts among Irish residents in the Bronx who could provide information about who might be involved in kidnapping operations. Johnson met with Foster on March 18th evening and explained the situation. Johnson needed detailed intelligence about the building on Prospect Avenue, how many entrances it had, what the interior layout was, whether neighbors might interfere with a rescue operation, and what routes could be used for approach and escape. Foster agreed to gather this information because he understood that rescuing Luciano's nephew would benefit Johnson's relationship with the Italian mob, and because Foster trusted Johnson's judgment about which operations were worth the risks involved. The second ally was Robert Henderson, who was 40 years old and who had extensive experience with breaking into locked buildings for burglary operations. Henderson knew how to open doors quietly, how to move through buildings without alerting occupants, and how to identify security measures like alarms or guards. Johnson met with Henderson on March 18th evening and explained that a rescue operation would require entering a building in the Bronx where a captive was being held by kidnappers. Johnson needed Henderson's expertise in building entry and interior movement. Henderson agreed to participate because he had worked with Johnson on previous operations and trusted Johnson to plan operations that minimized unnecessary risks. The third ally was Thomas Wright, who was 29 years old and who had military experience from serving in the Army from 1928 to 1932. Wright understood tactics, coordination, and how to move multiple people through operations without confusion. Johnson met with Wright on March 18th evening and explained that a rescue operation would require coordinating several people entering a building, locating a captive, neutralizing kidnappers if necessary, and extracting the captive safely. Johnson needed Wright to help plan the tactical execution. Wright agreed to participate because military-style operations appealed to his skills and because he respected Johnson's leadership. The fourth ally was Henry Lawson, who had brought the initial information and who would continue serving as Johnson's primary liaison with the source, who had first overheard the kidnappers' conversation. Lawson would maintain communication with the source to get any new information about the kidnappers' plans or any changes to the situation. These four allies represented the capabilities Johnson needed. Foster for intelligence about the location, Henderson for building entry expertise, Wright for tactical coordination, and Lawson for continued information gathering. Each understood their specific role and why their contribution mattered to the operation's success. Between March 18th evening and March 19th afternoon, this coalition gathered detailed information and planned the rescue operation. The plan had 5 components that would execute in sequence. The first component was confirming the nephew's location and the kidnappers' activities. Foster spent March 19th morning observing the building on Prospect Avenue from multiple positions. Foster confirmed that 2 white men in their 30s were using the building and that they appeared to be guarding something rather than conducting normal residential or business activities. Foster noted that the men were alert and frequently looked out windows, suggesting they were concerned about being discovered. Foster also observed that the building had a front entrance on Prospect Avenue and a rear entrance in an alley, and that the nearest police station was approximately 6 blocks away. The second component was determining the interior layout and the nephew's specific location within the building. Foster spoke with residents in adjacent buildings and learned that the building on Prospect Avenue had been mostly vacant for approximately 1 year after the previous owner died. The building had 3 floors with apartments on each floor, but only the ground floor appeared to be occupied currently. One resident mentioned hearing voices from the ground floor rear apartment during the previous 3 days, which corresponded with the timing of the nephew's disappearance. The third component was planning the entry and extraction. Henderson examined the building's rear entrance and determined that the lock could be opened quickly and quietly with proper tools. Wright developed a tactical plan where 4 men would enter through the rear. Henderson would open the lock. Wright and Foster would enter first to assess the situation. Henderson would follow, and Lawson would remain at the rear entrance to watch for interference and to signal if police or others approached. The plan called for entering at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the kidnappers would likely be sleeping or less alert. The fourth component was preparing for potential resistance. Wright and Foster would be armed with handguns in case the kidnappers resisted violently, but the plan emphasized surprise and speed over confrontation. The goal was to locate the nephew, secure him quickly, and exit before the kidnappers could organize effective resistance. If kidnappers were present and awake, Wright and Foster would use threats and intimidation to prevent resistance rather than immediately resorting to violence. The fifth component was establishing post-rescue procedures. Once the nephew was secured, Johnson would take him to a safe location in Harlem, would verify his identity and condition, and would then contact Luciano's organization to arrange the nephew's return to his family. Johnson would not demand payment or recognition, but would simply inform Luciano that his nephew had been rescued and was safe. These 5 components represented a comprehensive plan that addressed intelligence gathering, tactical execution, risk management, and follow-through. And the plan was scheduled to execute on the morning of March 20th, 2 days after Johnson first learned about the kidnapping, and 1 day before the kidnappers planned to move their captive. On the night of March 19th, Johnson met with Foster, Henderson, Wright, and Lawson to review the complete plan and to ensure everyone understood their roles. Johnson emphasized several points. The primary objective was recovering Luciano's nephew safely. Violence should be avoided unless necessary for defense or to overcome resistance. The operation needed to be completed quickly to minimize risks of police intervention or complications. If anything went wrong, or if the situation did not match their intelligence, they should withdraw rather than forcing the operation. At 2:30 on the morning of March 20th, Johnson and his 4 associates positioned themselves near the building on Prospect Avenue in the Bronx. The street was quiet and empty except for occasional cars passing. Foster and Wright were armed with handguns concealed under their coats. Henderson carried tools for opening the rear door lock. Lawson positioned himself where he could observe both the rear entrance and the street approaches to provide warning if anyone approached. At 2:55, Henderson approached the rear door and began working on the lock. Henderson had examined the lock during his earlier reconnaissance and knew exactly how to manipulate it. The lock opened within approximately 45 seconds. Henderson stepped aside, and Wright and Foster entered the ground-floor hallway. The hallway was dark and smelled of mildew and neglect. While Wright and Foster moved quietly toward the rear apartment where residents had reported hearing voices. Light showed under the door of the rear apartment. Wright and Foster positioned themselves on either side of the door and listened for approximately 30 seconds. They could hear breathing and slight movement inside the apartment, but no conversation. Wright tested the apartment door and found it unlocked. Wright pushed the door open quickly and entered with his handgun visible. Foster followed immediately behind. The apartment's main room contained 2 men sleeping on a couch and a chair. A door leading to what appeared to be a bedroom was closed. Wright pointed his handgun at the sleeping men and spoke loudly, instructing them not to move. A young man was tied to a chair with rope. A young man was tied to a chair with rope around his wrists and ankles. A cloth was tied across his mouth as a gag. The young man's eyes showed fear but also recognition that something was happening. Foster entered the bedroom and began untying the ropes, while Wright kept his handgun trained on the 2 kidnappers. Henderson entered the apartment and stood near the door watching the hallway. Within approximately 90 seconds, Foster had removed the ropes and the gag. The young man confirmed his name was Anthony Lucania and that these men had kidnapped him 3 days earlier. Wright instructed the 2 kidnappers to remain seated and not to follow them or to contact anyone about what had happened. Wright stated that the people who had sent them to recover Anthony Lucania would know who the kidnappers were and where to find them, and that any retaliation would be met with severe consequences. The kidnappers, still groggy from sleep and clearly frightened by armed men invading their location, made no move to resist. Foster helped Anthony walk to the apartment door. Anthony's legs were stiff from being tied to the chair for extended periods, but he could move with assistance. Wright backed out of the apartment, keeping his handgun visible to the kidnappers until he was in the hallway. Henderson, Foster, and Anthony exited through the rear door, followed by Wright. Lawson had seen no police or other interference during the operation. The entire operation inside the building had taken approximately 4 minutes. Johnson was waiting in a car 3 blocks from the building. Foster, Henderson, Wright, Lawson, and Anthony walked to the car and entered quickly. Johnson drove to Harlem, arriving at approximately 3:45 in the morning. Johnson took Anthony to a safe apartment where he provided food, water, and medical attention for the minor injuries Anthony had sustained during his captivity. By 4:30 that morning, the rescue operation was complete. Anthony Lucania was safe in Harlem, had been fed and given medical care, and was in stable condition. The kidnappers had been left unharmed, but had been warned not to pursue retaliation. No police had been involved, and no public attention had been drawn to the operation. Johnson spent the morning of March 20th talking with Anthony to understand exactly what had happened. Anthony explained that he had been walking near his home in Little Italy on the evening of March 15th, when two men had forced him into a car at gunpoint. The men had driven him to the Bronx and had held him in the apartment where he was rescued. The men had told Anthony that they planned to demand $5,000 ransom from his uncle Lucky Luciano. The men had not made the ransom demand yet because they were arguing about how to contact Luciano without being traced. Anthony stated that he had no idea who the men were or why they had targeted him specifically beyond knowing that his uncle was wealthy. Johnson understood from Anthony's account that the kidnappers were likely operating independently rather than as part of any organized criminal group. The kidnapping appeared to be an opportunistic crime by men who knew that Luciano had money and who believed they could profit by taking his nephew. This information was useful because it meant that rescuing Anthony would not create conflict with any established criminal organization. At 10 o'clock on the morning of March 20th, Johnson contacted one of Luciano's associates and stated that he had information about Anthony Lucania and that Luciano should send someone to meet with Johnson in Harlem. The associate agreed and stated that someone would arrive within 2 hours. At noon on March 20th, Frank Costello arrived at Johnson's office in Harlem. Costello was 37 years old and was one of Luciano's most trusted associates and advisors. Costello had worked with Luciano since the 1920s and was deeply involved in Luciano's operations. Johnson and Costello knew each other through the agreement that Johnson and Luciano had negotiated in 1935, and they had met several times over the previous 3 years to discuss business matters. Johnson explained to Costello that Anthony Lucania had been kidnapped 3 days earlier by 2 Irish men who were holding him in the Bronx and planning to demand ransom. Johnson stated that he had learned about the kidnapping through sources, had located where Anthony was being held, and had conducted a rescue operation that morning. Anthony was safe, unharmed except for minor injuries, and was ready to return to his family. Johnson stated that he was providing this information and returning Anthony to Luciano without expecting payment or recognition, simply because Luciano was Johnson's ally, and because protecting allies' families was important. Costello listened carefully and asked several questions. How had Johnson learned about the kidnapping? How did Johnson know where Anthony was being held? What had happened to the kidnappers? Was anyone else aware of the kidnapping or the rescue? Did Johnson want anything in return for rescuing Anthony? Johnson answered each question truthfully while protecting the identity of his sources. Johnson explained that he had learned about the kidnapping through contacts who had overheard the kidnappers talking. Johnson had located Anthony through investigation and surveillance. Johnson did not want anything in return. Johnson did not want anything in return except the understanding that he and Luciano were allies who would help each other when serious problems arose. Costello stated that he needed to verify Anthony's identity and condition before proceeding. Johnson brought Anthony into the office, and Costello confirmed that this was indeed Luciano's nephew. Anthony was in good condition considering his ordeal, tired, somewhat bruised from being tied up, but not seriously injured. Anthony confirmed Johnson's account of the rescue and stated that Johnson's associates had treated him respectfully and had provided food and medical care. Costello stated that Luciano would want to meet with Johnson personally to express gratitude and to discuss the implications of what Johnson had done. Costello asked whether Johnson would be willing to meet with Luciano that afternoon. Johnson agreed. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of March 20th, Johnson met with Lucky Luciano at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Luciano was 40 years old and had been the most powerful Italian mob boss in New York since eliminating Salvatore Maranzano in 1931. Luciano controlled gambling, labor racketeering, prostitution, and other criminal enterprises throughout New York, and had influence over Italian crime families nationally through the commission he had established. Luciano and Johnson had met multiple times since 1935 to play chess and to discuss business matters, and their relationship had been cordial and mutually beneficial. Luciano stated immediately that Costello had briefed him about Anthony's kidnapping and rescue. Luciano expressed gratitude that Johnson had acted so quickly and effectively to recover his nephew. Luciano stated that he had not even known Anthony was missing until Costello informed him that afternoon. Anthony's parents had not reported the disappearance because they feared that contacting police or making inquiries would endanger Anthony if he had indeed been kidnapped. Luciano asked Johnson to explain exactly how the rescue had been accomplished. Johnson provided a detailed account of how he had learned about the kidnapping, how he had investigated to locate Anthony, how he had organized the rescue operation, and how the operation had been executed. Johnson emphasized that the entire operation had taken less than 48 hours from initial information to successful rescue, that no one had been killed or seriously injured, that no police attention had been drawn, and that Anthony had been treated with care after his recovery. Luciano listened carefully and stated several things in response. First, Luciano was impressed by the speed and effectiveness of Johnson's intelligence network. The fact that Johnson had learned about a kidnapping in the Bronx within hours of kidnappers discussing it demonstrated remarkable information-gathering capabilities. Second, Luciano appreciated that Johnson had acted without being asked and without expecting payment. This demonstrated loyalty and genuine alliance rather than opportunism. Third, Luciano understood that Johnson had taken significant risks by operating in the Bronx, and by confronting armed kidnappers. A failed rescue could have resulted in Anthony's death and could have created serious problems for Johnson. Luciano stated that rescuing his nephew created an obligation that Luciano intended to honor. Luciano asked what Johnson wanted in return for this service. Johnson stated that he did not want payment because allies should help each other when family members were in danger. However, Johnson stated that the rescue did demonstrate the value of the alliance between them, and that Johnson hoped Luciano would remember this if situations arose in the future where Johnson needed assistance or support from Luciano's organization. Luciano agreed completely and stated that Johnson had earned significant credit with Luciano personally and with the Italian mob more broadly. Luciano stated that if Johnson ever needed help with anything, protection, resources, intervention with other crime families, or assistance with problems that required capabilities beyond what Johnson could provide through his Harlem operation, Johnson should contact Luciano, and that assistance would be provided without hesitation. Luciano also stated that the tribute payments Johnson made to Luciano's organization would be reduced by 50% for the next year, as a gesture of appreciation for rescuing Anthony. Johnson accepted these terms and stated that he appreciated Luciano's recognition of what had been done. The meeting concluded with Luciano and Johnson agreeing to continue their regular chess games, and with both understanding that their alliance had been significantly strengthened by the events of the previous 48 hours. The resolution of Anthony Lucania's kidnapping created effects that extended far beyond one young man's safe return to his family. The demonstration that Bumpy Johnson had intelligence capabilities that could detect kidnappings in the Bronx, investigation skills that could locate captives within 48 hours, and operational capacity to conduct successful rescues reinforced Johnson's reputation as a sophisticated operator whose power derived from information and organization rather than just violence. While the establishment of a significant obligation from Lucky Luciano to Bumpy Johnson shifted the power dynamics in their relationship. While Johnson had previously been a junior partner who paid tribute to Luciano in exchange for autonomy in Harlem, Johnson was now someone to whom Luciano owed a personal debt related to family. This obligation gave Johnson leverage in future negotiations and provided protection if conflicts arose with other Italian crime families. The 50% reduction in tribute payments for 1 year represented approximately $10,000 in savings for Johnson's organization, a substantial financial benefit that Johnson could reinvest in operations used to strengthen his position in Harlem or save for future needs. The reduction also served as public acknowledgement within the criminal underworld that Johnson had done Luciano a significant favor. The precedent that Johnson would help protect Luciano's family members from threats created an expectation of reciprocity. Luciano would be expected to help protect Johnson's family or associates if they faced similar dangers. This mutual protection arrangement strengthened both organizations' security and deterred potential attackers who understood that targeting either Johnson's or Luciano's people would trigger responses from both organizations. For the broader relationship between Black and Italian organized crime in New York, the incident demonstrated that cross-ethnic alliances could operate on the basis of genuine mutual support rather than just transactional arrangements. Johnson had not asked permission before conducting the rescue, had not demanded payment, and had taken risks to help an ally. This set a standard for how allied criminal organizations should treat each other's emergencies. The 2 Irish kidnappers who had held Anthony Lucania were found dead in their Bronx apartment approximately 1 week after the rescue. While no one was ever charged with these murders and they were officially listed as unsolved homicides, people in the criminal underworld understood that Luciano's organization had eliminated the kidnappers as punishment for targeting a family member. The killings sent a message that kidnapping people connected to major crime figures would result in death even if the victim was recovered safely. Johnson's willingness to conduct operations outside Harlem demonstrated to other criminal organizations that his capabilities were not limited to his home territory. The successful operation in the Bronx showed that Johnson could gather intelligence, plan operations, and execute missions in unfamiliar neighborhoods when necessary. This expanded perception of Johnson's operational range increased his strategic value as an ally and potential threat as an adversary. The case illustrated principles that characterized Johnson's most effective operations. The response to Anthony's kidnapping had been based on accurate intelligence gathered quickly through Johnson's information network. The operation had been planned carefully with specific roles for people with appropriate skills. The execution had been swift and effective, accomplishing the objective without unnecessary violence or complications. The follow-through had focused on returning Anthony safely and on building the relationship with Luciano, rather than on seeking immediate rewards. The emphasis on speed was critical. Johnson acted within 48 hours of learning about the kidnapping, before the kidnappers moved Anthony or made ransom demands that would have complicated the situation. This rapid response required having systems in place for gathering information quickly, making decisions based on incomplete but sufficient information, organizing resources efficiently, and executing operations without excessive planning or delay. The careful management of relationships demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how obligations and debts functioned in organized crime. Johnson could have demanded payment for rescuing Anthony, but instead he framed the rescue as an act of alliance and allowed Luciano to determine how to reciprocate. This approach created a stronger obligation than any negotiated payment would have produced, because it appealed to Luciano's sense of honor and family loyalty. The story of how Bumpy Johnson learned that Lucky Luciano's nephew had been kidnapped and how Johnson organized a rescue operation that recovered the nephew safely within 48 hours became one of many narratives that circulated about Johnson's capabilities and his relationships with other crime figures. The story emphasized the intelligence network that detected the kidnapping quickly, the investigation that located the victim, the tactical planning that enabled the successful rescue, and the strengthened alliance that resulted from Johnson's loyalty to an ally in crisis. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson understood power and relationships. Allies' family members deserved protection even without being asked. Intelligence and organization were more valuable than impulsive action. Speed was critical when opportunities or emergencies arose. Helping powerful figures created obligations that strengthened long-term position. Real victories were measured not by immediate rewards, but by whether relationships were strengthened, whether leverage was gained, whether reputation was enhanced, and whether precedents were established that would benefit operations in the future. The legacy extended beyond Anthony's individual rescue. The precedent that Johnson would help protect Luciano's family influenced how other Italian crime figures perceived Johnson. The demonstration that Johnson had sophisticated intelligence capabilities influenced how other criminals understood the risks of operating in or near Harlem. The obligation Luciano owed Johnson provided leverage that Johnson used in subsequent years when conflicts arose or when Johnson needed support from Italian crime families. These outcomes required no celebration or exaggeration to demonstrate their value. A young man was rescued from kidnappers. A relationship was strengthened significantly. An obligation was created, leverage was gained, A reputation was enhanced, financial benefits resulted. A precedent was established. The legacy endured. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano continued until Luciano's deportation to Italy in 1946. During those 8 years, from 1938 to 1946, Luciano and Johnson continued meeting regularly to play chess and to discuss business matters. Luciano referred to the rescue of his nephew multiple times in conversations with other mob figures as an example of Johnson's loyalty and capabilities. When Johnson faced legal problems in the 1940s that could have been worsened by pressure from Italian crime families, Luciano ensured that Johnson received no interference from Italian operations. After Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, the relationship continued through letters and through messages conveyed by people who visited Luciano in Italy. When Johnson was convicted on drug conspiracy charges in 1952 and sentenced to 15 years at Alcatraz, Luciano sent messages through associates stating that Johnson's family would be protected during his imprisonment and that Johnson's Harlem operations would not be interfered with by Italian crime families. Frank Costello, who had been present when Johnson returned Anthony to Luciano's organization in 1938, maintained a relationship with Johnson until Johnson's death in 1968. Costello frequently cited the rescue of Anthony Lucania as an example of the kind of loyalty that should characterize relationships between allied crime organizations. Anthony Lucania himself remained grateful to Johnson for his rescue and maintained contact with Johnson over the years. Anthony avoided involvement in organized crime and instead becoming a legitimate businessman who operated restaurants in New York. Anthony attended Johnson's funeral in 1968, one of the few Italian Americans present at a service that was primarily attended by Harlem residents and black organized crime figures. The obligation that Luciano felt toward Johnson for rescuing his nephew influenced Luciano's approach to other situations where black and Italian organized crime interests intersected. Luciano was more willing to show flexibility in negotiations with black operators, more likely to support arrangements that gave black crime figures autonomy in their territories, and more likely to discourage Italian crime families from attempting to take over black operations by force. While Luciano's motivations included pragmatic calculations about the costs of conflict, his personal sense of obligation to Johnson reinforced these pragmatic considerations. The rescue operation on the morning of March 20th, 1938, lasted approximately 4 minutes inside the building on Prospect Avenue in the Bronx. But the consequences of those 4 minutes, the obligation created, the relationship strengthened, the leverage gained, the precedent established, the reputation enhanced, influenced power dynamics between black and Italian organized crime in New York for decades afterward. The quiet power of the intervention, detecting the kidnapping quickly through intelligence networks, investigating to locate the victim, organizing a surgical rescue operation, returning the victim safely without demanding immediate reward, building the relationship strategically, and leveraging the resulting obligation over years stood in contrast to dramatic narratives that often characterized stories about criminal organizations. There was no prolonged hostage negotiation. There was no public showdown with kidnappers. There was no dramatic ransom payment. There was only efficient intelligence work, careful planning, swift execution, and strategic relationship management that created lasting advantages. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that helping allies' families created powerful obligations, that intelligence and speed were more valuable than firepower, that surgical operations were more effective than dramatic confrontations, that building relationships through loyalty was more valuable than extracting immediate payments, and that obligations strategically accumulated over time provided leverage in future negotiations, and that real victories were measured not by dramatic moments, but by whether relationships were strengthened, whether leverage was gained, whether precedents were established that deterred future threats, whether reputations were enhanced in ways that increased influence, and whether the quiet work of gathering intelligence, planning carefully, executing efficiently, and managing relationships strategically created advantages that endured long after the immediate crisis was resolved.